Okay, so we're going to look at the horizontal shifts of trig functions for sine and cosine. Here are your transformational graphs of a sine b of x minus h plus k, and then cosine is the same thing. It's just changing kind of the starting value. Because remember, sine is looking at the y-coordinate of the unit circle as we move around with relationship to the angle, and cosine is looking at the x variable, or x value of the ordered pair. So amplitude, remember, is half the distance between the max and the min. Also known as A, and the amplitude is equal to the absolute value of A because it can be up or down, but it's half the distance, and distance we measure as a positive value. The period is equal to 2 pi divided by the B value. Remember, the period is number of units to complete one full cycle. Of the function. Okay? H is going to be what we call a phase shift, and that's my horizontal movement. Change. And then K is my vertical shift. And for the vertical shift, we are shifting the midline. So the midline goes up or down with the K value. Okay, so for our graph of sine and cosine today with the phase shift, the first thing you need to do is find a starting and ending point. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this middle piece, and what we have to do is determine where that is for our new starting and ending point. So traditionally we go from 0 to 2 pi, and the function is between 0 and 2 pi. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this b x minus h, and we're going to put it in between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, so whatever's inside the function, we're going to put it between 0 and 2 pi, and that's going to tell us our new starting and ending points. Okay, so if I take a look at this first example, we're going to take x minus pi over 3, because in this case I have actually a 1 times x minus pi over 3, and so I have 0 between x minus pi over 3 between 2 pi. Now, I don't know if you've covered compound inequalities before, but to solve them, we essentially add pi over 3 to both pieces of the function. So now this new start becomes pi over 3, and then I have an x value because that eliminates, and then I'm taking 2 pi plus pi over 3. So for adding fractions, we need to have a common denominator. So if I multiply that by 3, then I'm going to multiply this by 3, and so I get 6. 6 pi over 3 plus 1 pi over 3 is 7 pi over 3. 1 pi over 3. And so those are your new x values. Pi over 3, and then 7 pi over 3. And my critical values for sine are still the same. Remember, it goes 0, then max, then 0, then min, and then 0. So I'm going to have a 0. The max in this case, because the amplitude is 1, is still going to be 1. Then I come back to 0. I go down to -1, and then back to 0. So now we need to figure out what that middle value is. Same process as before. Add the two together, divide by 2. So pi over 3 plus 7 pi over 3 is equal to 8 pi over 3 divided by 2, or times half, is equal to 8 pi over 6, or 4/3 pi. So this is 4/3 pi. All right, so now I need to figure out what's halfway in between pi over 3 and 4/3 pi. So pi over 3 plus 4 pi over 3 is equal to 5 pi over 3, but then I want to take half of that, which is equal to 5 pi over 6. And then down here, same thing, so I'm taking 4 pi over 3 plus 7 pi over 3, and I get 11 pi over 3 times 1/2, dividing that by 2, and I got 11 pi over 6. Okay, I know that was kind of messy. But, so now here is my traditional start at 0, and usually it goes up and then down and then back here at 2 pi, right? That's what it normally looks like. But we have to, we need to shift our graph over a little bit. So instead of going from 0 to 2 pi, it's going to go to pi over 3. So we're going to start at pi over 3 is going to be, and maybe we'll call this pi over 3. It's about 1/3 of a way, or 1/3 of a unit away. And then everything is going to shift a little bit further. So 7 pi over 3 is a little bit more than 2 pi. Okay, and then pi 4/3 pi is a little bit more than pi. And then I have 5 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. Okay, so, and then we still go up to 1 and we still go down to -1. So the only thing that happens is I'm shifting over to the right. And so we have to think that this is going to continue. And if we wanted to go the other direction, we could. So I could subtract. Okay, I could find out how many units I'm actually counting by, and I know that this is going to continue going down at some point, and over on this side I would find where my new minimum is. Okay, and I actually should keep that going up and down. So that's one period of the sine function with a horizontal shift. Okay, the phase shift horizontally is the most complicated transformation of a periodic function. So it is sometimes a little bit challenging. All right, so let's take a look at this cosine graph. So the cosine graph here, remember again, we're going to take our x plus pi over 2, and I'm going to set that between 0 and 2 pi. 0 and 2 pi. The -2 affects my amplitude. Okay, so that tells me that 1, I'm going to reflect. Okay, and I'm also going to have a vertical stretch. So my max and my min are going to go to positive and -2. So when I look at cosine, which normally is max, then 0, then min, then 0, then max, if I flip it or reflect it, what happens is I actually am in a min, then 0, then a max, then 0, and then a min. So my minimum is going to be at -2, then I'm at 0. My maximum is at +2, then I'm at 0, and then I'm back to my minimum at -2. The question is, what are the x values in which this occurs? So I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to solve by subtracting pi over 2 from everything. That's a minus pi over 2. So I get negative pi over 2 is the start. And then, let's see if I take 2 pi minus a half. So 2 pi minus a half pi. So if I give this a denominator of 2, then this needs to be a 4. So I get 3 pi over 2. And x is in between. So 3 pi over 2 is when I go back up, or back down, I should say, to a minimum. So now what's halfway between negative pi over 2 and positive 3 pi over 2? So negative pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2 is equal to 2 pi over 2 times a half, and we get 2 pi over 4, which is 1/2 pi. So a half pi. Okay, so then what is in between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2? That's actually 0. And what's in between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 is 1 pi. Excuse me. So let's go over here. So negative pi over 2, that actually is to the left of the origin. Then we have 0, then we have pi over 2, and then pi, and then 3 pi over 2. Okay, so we're taking that cosine graph. Remember, cosine looks like this. And we're flipping it. So we flip it over, and it looks like we're shifting it to the left. Okay, so I'm going to go back down. Sorry. There it is. So I'm at a negative 2. Also, my amplitude is down here. So negative 2 and then positive 2. So we're starting at a minimum. Change colors. Starting at a minimum. Then at 0. On my way up to a maximum. I'm at a maximum. I go back to 0. And I'm down back to a minimum. So this is one cycle of cosine, and then I would jump back up, or not jump, but I would curve back up. Okay, so that's one cycle, and I could continue it. So notice how cosine normally starts at a maximum on the y-axis, but it isn't this time because I am shifting the graph. Actually, I shifted right or I shifted left and reflected. So you can look at it both ways because it's periodic. There's actually a couple of different transformations that could occur. Okay, so if I look at the domain is still, periodic functions are always going to go from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, in this case, now I'm going from negative 2, and I'm going to use brackets this time, to positive 2, and it's inclusive. The period has to do with the b value. There is no coefficient of b, so 2 pi divided by 1 is just a period of 2 pi. The amplitude is 2. We're stretching out 2 units. The midline, there was not a vertical shift, so the midline is still y equals 0. It's still the x-axis is the midline. The x-intercepts, there's 2 of them. In this original, it's 0 and pi. And the y-intercept is 0, 0. Okay? All right. So that's the notes. The main thing is, for this shift, you're going to have this part right here where you have to set it equal or in between 0 and 2 pi. All right. Have a great day.